Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here. Over the last few days, I've seen a lot of speculation about Tesla's Model Y and when deliveries are going to begin, with some people suggesting that maybe they're beginning within the next couple of weeks or perhaps have already begun. So let's figure out exactly what's going on. We're going to look at all the speculation that we have, all of the confirmed information we have, and some of the stuff that kind of falls in the middle. And then we'll look at some timelines and really figure out if we can decide when Tesla is most likely to deliver the first Tesla Model Ys and where it goes from there. So first, let's start off with some social media stuff. This falls into the most speculative category, obviously, but it is also the category that gets people the most excited. We do have some news here today via Reddit, with user Qua4 posting to one of the Tesla subreddits, quote, "Model Y deliveries confirmed for next month," end quote. So I'll read this quickly and then we can decide whether or not it's worthwhile information. He says, quote, "I just received a phone call from an employee at Tesla Oakville, Ontario, who was calling to guide me through the upcoming delivery process for my Model Y. I asked when to expect delivery, and he told me that the performance variant will start deliveries next month, and that I could expect my long-range all-wheel drive in March/April, end quote. All right, so there's a couple red flags with this one right off the bat. First of all, employee information has been super spotty on Tesla in the past and has led many Tesla fans and investors astray. So anything that we hear from that channel should be taken with a grain of salt naturally. Then since it is posted on social media, obviously this is sort of third-party information, so we have to take that with another grain of salt. Then this information is coming from Canada, which seems a bit unusual because Tesla usually begins deliveries for any new product in California. And this person doesn't have a performance Model Y on order, so it's not like he's at the very front of the queue for Canada, even in the first place. Putting all of that together, there are just too many variables here for us to put much weight in this information. I think this person probably did receive a call from Tesla with this information, but even that doesn't give us much to go off of based on the track record of this sort of information. And I'll give you an example of that here in a second. The reason I think people might be more excited about this is because of a tweet that we had a couple of days ago. So this comes from, I believe, a Tesla owner on Twitter at Moez. He says, quote, "Confirmed," in all caps, "from a Tesla employee, Model Y first deliveries happening in 2 weeks," end quote. Adding, in reply to other tweets, that he got this information from a Tesla employee in Fremont, and quote, "He said that there was internal launch event last week, and they are working extra hard to make it happen in 2 weeks," end quote. All right, so this suffers from the same problem that the information from Reddit did. It's coming from an unverified employee source, which has led us astray in the past. Let me give you an example of that. This is just one of many of these types of examples, though. So this is an email from a listener back in mid-November. It says Model Y delivery information, and here he is citing an employee that he heard information about Model Y from at that point in time, saying, quote, "He said he has friends at Fremont, and based on what he's heard, the Model Y is ready, and they are planning to deliver a few hundred Model Ys by the end of this year," end quote. Even this source says, I'm not sure if this can be trusted, but he did sound very knowledgeable. So this is very similar to what we're seeing today on Reddit and Twitter. And yes, that is two separate sources, but in this case, there were also two separate sources at this period of time saying similar things as well. Eventually, one of these rumors will be right. It's just tough to put much stock in them without other supporting evidence. So let's take a look at what other information we have, which I think is actually more interesting, especially when paired with some of these more rumor mill type of things. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, Tesla originally guided for production of the Model Y in late 2020. On the Q3 earnings call in mid-October, they updated that guidance, saying, quote, "Model Y ahead of schedule, production expected by summer 2020, end quote. With Elon Musk on the earnings call the same day saying, quote, "There may be some room for improvement there, but we're confident about summer 2020. I've actually recently driven the Model Y release candidate and think it's going to be an amazing product, very well received. I think it's quite likely to, just my opinion, but I think it will outsell Model S, Model X, and Model 3 combined," end quote. Later on the same call, Elon was asked again about Model Y launch timing, and he said, quote, "Well, we've talked about the launch time. What really matters is the timing to volume production, where volume production is some number in excess of 1,000 units per week, and we're confident of reaching that point no later than the middle of 2020, end quote. So that is the entirety of the recently communicated information on Model Y officially from Tesla. All of that information can be summarized by saying Tesla is targeting volume production in excess of 1,000 units per week by the middle of 2020. This gives us a strong benchmark to work back from for initial deliveries, so keep that in mind for a little bit later. We do still have some more official information, but this time coming from third parties, the California Air and Resource Board, known as CARB, and the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, known as NHTSA. On NHTSA's end, as we talked about last week, the vehicle identification numbers for the Model Y have been made available in NHTSA's VIN decoder, which, from my understanding, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that is a prerequisite to beginning customer deliveries. And even if it's not technically a prerequisite, it is something that needs to definitely be available at some point. So a good box to check. And then on the California Air and Resources Board, because they regulate zero emission vehicle credits or ZEV credits, they require manufacturers to submit for certification for those zero emission vehicles. I also believe this to be a prerequisite. In the case of the NHTSA VINs, unfortunately no one seems to know when this process happened for the Model X or the Model S, so it doesn't really give us much in terms of timeline. But on the Carb Certification, this does actually give us a lot of information. So we'll analyze all this timeline stuff here in a second. The last piece of evidence that I want to present is the Model Y release candidate sightings in the wild. So not the prototype that debuted in March, but actual release candidates that have been seen driving around testing by employees. These have been ever increasing, and now it seems like every day we see at least 1 or 2 new posts about Model Y sightings, which is absolutely a sign that we're getting close to deliveries. But I think what's interesting is to compare when we first started seeing them out in public testing compared to what we saw in the past with Model X and Model 3. So the first real release candidate Model Y that we saw out in the wild was on October 2nd of 2019, with the frequency of sightings ramping up since then, but we can use that original sighting as a benchmark versus Model 3 and Model X. So we've got a lot of information here that we can try to piece together to really figure out when is most likely for those first Model Y deliveries. This is where we start to get into some numbers, so if you're audio only, I apologize, but the first thing I want to look at is the Carb Certification. So we can look at the days from certification to first deliveries for Model S, Model X, and Model 3 to get a gauge for Model Y since we have those certification dates. The reason I say dates here is because the Carb Certification is a little bit weird. There are 2 dates. There's a signed date on the document, the executive order that they publish, and then there's actually the published date. So I don't know which is better to use as a reference point, so I've included both in this analysis, and I think they might actually both be helpful. Let me walk through the Model S as an example. So the date the Carb Certification was actually signed by the California Air and Resources Board for the Model S was March 28th, 2012, but it was not published until May 7th, 2012, and the first deliveries for the Model S were on June 5th, 2012. So it was 69 days from the signed date and 29 days from the published date until those first deliveries happened. For the Model 3, it was 25 days from signed and 17 days from published until the first deliveries. And then for the Model X, it's a little bit weird. We're actually missing a piece of information because there was a certification that ended up overriding another certification. And when that happened, the California Air and Resources Board removed that prior certification from their website. So I only have one piece of information here, which I believe is the publishing date rather than the signed date. But I do have a call placed into the California Air and Resources Board. So if I get any more information on that, I will update it in the YouTube description and comments. But if my assumption is correct, then it was 13 days from the published date to the first delivery of the Tesla Model X. So assuming that is correct, that means from the published date till first delivery is 29 days, 13 days, and 17 days, an average of 20. And then a bit wider range on the actual signed date, since the Model S was 69 and the Model 3 was 25, and the Model X is question mark. But this does give us some nice data points to apply to the Model Y. So the Model Y Carb Certification was signed on December 19th, 2019. And was published on January 9th, 2020. So as I'm recording, it's been 12 days since the published date and 33 days since the signed date, meaning we're actually getting in range here for first deliveries based on the timelines of Tesla's other vehicles. If we look at the context from these social media rumors that we have for deliveries next month or deliveries in a couple weeks, and we know that Tesla also has an upcoming earnings report on January 29th, a lot of these stars are starting to align around February 1st as a potential date for first deliveries. On YouTube, you can see that I've graphed the brackets of both the signing date, which is the top line here, and the publishing date, which is the bottom line here, in terms of number of days out from first deliveries to give us a visual feel for those ranges. And you can see that the February 1st timeline, if we assume that, fits really nicely into those brackets that we have on the other vehicles. If we switch it to March 1st, it actually begins to head out into uncharted territory. At that point, we'd be looking at 73 days from the signed date and 52 days from the published date, both of which would be the longest periods of time for any Tesla vehicle launched so far. If we push even further out and assume April 1st as first deliveries, then we really start to look out of place, as that puts days since signed at 104 days and days since published at 83 days, both well ahead of any of the other highs. Knowing that, let's bring in our other piece of evidence, which is the release candidate sightings in the wild. We can compare timelines here as well. In this case, we're looking at a couple metrics. We're looking at the number of months between the first release candidate sightings in the wild and first deliveries. And then we're also looking at from there how long it took to get to volume production. Because we have that benchmark that Elon mentioned on the call, of Model Y being at volume production, 1,000 or more per week, by mid-2020. That gives us a nice starting point since we know the release candidate timeline for the Model Y, and an ending point because we know volume production for the Model Y, assuming they hit their targets, which should allow us to work nicely into first deliveries. So let's walk through the Model X timeline. For example, the first release candidate sighting was on February 11th of 2015, and the first Model X deliveries were on September 29th, 2015. Albeit that was only 6 vehicles, they were founders editions for early investors and such. The first customer deliveries were on December 18th, 2015, so I put that in here as a timeline as well. But however you look at it, it was either 8 or 10 months from that first release candidate sighting to first deliveries. Then the second part of the timeline for the Model X was getting to volume production. Here I defined that as 500 per week, and that happened about August 2016. These are just rough numbers here. So from release candidate to volume production was 18 months for the Model X. Looking at Model 3, the first release candidate sighting was really April 4th, 2017, with first deliveries happening July 28th, so about 4 months there between sighting and first delivery, with the Model 3 hitting volume production of 1,000 or more per week, so comparable to the Model Y target that we're looking for here, in about May of 2018, so about 9 months from first delivery to that 1,000 per week. Now in the case of the Model Y, we know this timeline should be compressed, so I would view those timelines as upper boundaries, and then for a lower boundary, we can bring in the China-made Model 3. We have to estimate a little bit here, but the release candidate sightings, quote unquote, for the made in China Model 3 really happened around November 3rd when we started seeing some Model 3s piling up in the Gigafactory Shanghai parking lot. First deliveries, of course, then happened on December 29th, so about 2 months there. And then to volume, which we'll call 1,000 per week here, we'll conservatively go with the end of Q1. I know Tesla used an extrapolated rate to say 3,000 per week at the end of Q4. That's an extrapolated rate. It's not steady state. It's going to take Tesla some time to get up to that speed. So if you want to use a different number here, go ahead. But if we assume end of March, that would be 3 months from first delivery to volume production. Okay, so if we look at the total timeline here from release candidate sighting to volume production, we're looking at 18 months for the Model X, 13 months for the US-made Model 3, and 5 months for the China-made Model 3. The first release candidate sighting for the Model Y in the wild appears to be October 2nd, 2019, and Tesla's targeting volume production summer 2020. Let's give them a bit of a cushion and say August. Remember, Elon said middle, so we'll shift that back a bit. Then we're looking at 10 months from release candidate sighting to volume production, which fits oh so nicely on this graph. You go down from 18 with the Model X to 13 with the Model 3 to 10 with the Model Y and 5 with Gigafactory Shanghai. Shanghai should be a lower bound because the Model Y does have a lot shared with the Model 3, but it does have some new parts too, whereas Shanghai should be much more of a duplication. So whether you assume volume production in June, July, August, whatever the case may be, the Model Y timeline still fits really nicely between these boundaries. Knowing that that feels good, we can break that down to its components to get a feel for first deliveries. So if we put in that date of February 1st, then we're almost on that exact same 4-month timeline for the Model 3 from release candidate to first deliveries, actually even a bit later. So that part actually feels really good, and then that gives us 6 months from the first delivery to volume production, compared to about 9 months for the US-made Model 3, and about 3 months for the China-made Model 3, or whatever number you want to put there. So again, in this case, with that February 1st delivery date, we're right in between those boundaries, which feels good. If you move to March, you're looking at a pretty even split of 5 months from release candidate sighting to first delivery, and 5 months from first delivery to volume production, and that still fits pretty nicely as well. Again though, in this case, if you move out to April, you're looking at 6 months between release candidate and first delivery, and then 4 months to volume production, which just doesn't seem to fit quite as nicely here either. So piecing together all of this, I think February or March is most likely, and I would have to give the edge to February. The Model Y on that timeline does a lot of good things for Tesla. That's why it's number 6 in my top 10 reasons for Tesla stock going crazy over the last few months. So check that video out if you haven't already. And again, Tesla has their Q4 update on Wednesday, January 29th, so we should get some more information on the Model Y then. Wouldn't totally shock me if they announced that employee deliveries have already started or if they're happening in the next week. Either way, I'll be here covering everything, so don't forget to subscribe. Also make sure you're following me on Twitter @TeslaPodcast, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.